the hearings that we had seemed to me to be a great opportunity for us not only to educate non-Aboriginal society about what Aboriginal people were saying and who they were, but it was also an opportunity for us to educate Aboriginal people about what they were and what they were doing. One of the things that we discovered was that situation that we have in our jail system and in our court system really began in the 1950s. Up until the Second World War, in fact, Aboriginal people were not overrepresented in our jails. The 1962 statistics for Stony Mountain Penitentiary show that the number of Aboriginal men at Stony Mountain Penitentiary was less than 25%. Now it's somewhere in the area of 50 to 60%. In addition to that, Aboriginal overrepresentation in the child welfare system was not the case in the 50s or up until the Second World War. Child welfare cases involving Aboriginal people don't begin to increase, in fact, until the 60s. What we're really seeing beginning around the Second World War, or shortly after the 40s, what we're beginning to see is the breakdown of Aboriginal communities and the breakdown of Aboriginal families. And what caused me to think about that was to look at why that was happening. Why indeed did that begin to happen? And we have to go back a long time in order to find the roots of that. But for me, the beginning of the downfall of Aboriginal people was the beginning of the attack on Aboriginal culture. And that begins at the time of Confederation, 1867. For at that time, when the Dominion of Canada was formed, the government of Canada established a policy very early on that was enunciated by Sir John A. Macdonald, who was then the Prime Minister of Canada, and the first Superintendent General of Indian Affairs, when he said that within a very short time there will be no Indian problem because there will be no Indian people. The government of Canada decided that as its policy that it would move towards the removal of Indian peoples from their special status, the removal of Indian people from their special rights, and in fact the denigration of Indian cultures. He set upon a policy of ensuring that Aboriginal people would be assimilated, forcibly if necessary, into Canadian society, so that there would be, within a short time, no distinction between Indian people and the rest of society. That was Canadian government policy. And they began doing that by passing laws that had that as their intent. With the first Indian Act of 1874, the first attempt at the government of Canada to pass Indian legislation in this country concentrated upon, first of all, ensuring that Indian people had no special rights. And in fact, that if they were going to maintain their identity as Indian people, then they had no rights at all. For the first Indian Act said that no Indian person was capable of selling any assets that he owned, that no Indian person could own property outside of an Indian reserve, and no Indian person had the right to sell any property that he owned on an Indian reserve. Indian bands were prohibited by law from leasing any of their lands. Indian bands were prohibited by law from selling any of their produce, any of their mineral rights, from selling any assets that were located upon their lands. So in effect, the government passed a law which said there can be no economic development on Indian lands in that period of time. They also passed a law that said no non-Indian person can establish a business on an Indian reservation without first of all getting the permission of the local Indian agent or the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs. And that permission was never given. The government of Canada established a policy that they would not allow any infrastructure development as we've come to know it, and that is any local development, any development of roads and highways on Indian reserves, because in their view it was just a matter of time before Indian reserves no longer existed. So they passed those laws in 1874 with the intent being that ultimately not only would these reserves not exist as special land holdings, but the people who lived on them would no longer live either on those lands or as an identifiable group of people. Shortly after that, in 1882, the government passed a law which said that any Indian person between the ages of 5 and 17 had to attend a school designated by the Superintendent General of Indian Affairs. And those schools, of course, came to be known as the residential schools in this country. The residential schools is an area of Indian history that I think needs further study, because we are only beginning to tap some of the issues that went on within the residential school system. And unfortunately, at this point in time, I'm not sure that as an Aboriginal community we're ready to look at that history, because the pain of what we had to go through as a result of those schools is still too intense. But nonetheless, it's an area that I think requires further exploration, requires further regard. But we know at bottom that there was considerable amounts of abuse that went on in those schools. And the abuse was not merely physical, but it was primarily emotional, psychological. Indian kids who went to those schools were told that there was no hope in continuing to be an Indian, in fact. They were told that their cultures were savage and barbaric. They were told that they could not speak their language, that their language was inferior. They were, in fact, punished if they did that. They were told that the things that their fathers and mothers and their grandmothers and grandfathers believed in were wrong, were simply wrong. And they were told that if they continued to believe in those things that their grandparents had taught them to believe in, that they would be punished for that. They were prohibited and prevented from participating in any of the spiritual and cultural ceremonies that were important to our people at the time. And they were told that if they continued to try to do that, that they would be physically punished, and many were. They were told that the things that their fathers and mothers and their grandmothers and grandfathers believed in were wrong, were simply wrong. And they were told that if they continued to believe in those things that their grandparents had taught them to believe in, that they would be punished for that. They were prohibited and prevented from participating in any of the spiritual and cultural ceremonies that were important to our people at the time. And they were told that if they continued to try to do that, that they would be physically punished, and many were. In addition to that, because the government wanted to separate the children from their parents, they were prohibited from leaving the schools in many cases until they were adults and returning to their communities. And in addition to that, the government prohibited parents from leaving their reserves to go to those schools and try to remove their children. And that resulted in a system administratively set up, never by law, called the Indian Pass system. And that policy was that Indian people who wanted to leave their reservations for any reason had to first of all get written permission from the local Indian agent. And if they did not have that permission, then they would be arrested and locked up and either returned to their reserve or they'd be kept in jail. But in addition to all of that, as parents, if you can imagine for a moment what it would be like for someone to tell you that your children would be taken away from you and your children would be put into a residential school type of setting, and that you as a parent would not be allowed to see them, can you imagine for a moment how you would react as parents? Most of you are mothers. Most of you would kill the person who suggested that to you. And most of you would try to do something about it. There's no question of that. Well, Indian people did too. They tried to do something about it. They organized large gatherings. They sent delegations to Ottawa to try to change the law. They began legal actions in court, and all of this is documented in our history. So the government decided to deal with that too. They passed a law shortly after the Indian Residential School Amendment to say that if 3 or more Indians got together in order to discuss a grievance against the government of Canada, that they were guilty of an offense and that they could be prosecuted and sent to jail. And they said that if an Indian began a legal action against the government of Canada in order to challenge anything that the government of Canada did without getting the permission of the government to begin that legal action, then that legal action could be dismissed out of hand. And they said that if a lawyer accepted a retainer from an Indian or from anybody on behalf of an Indian to commence a legal action, then that lawyer could lose his right to practice law, and that lawyer could be prosecuted and sent to jail. So what they did was they took the rule of law, and the rule of law says that everybody is subject to the law, and that everybody must have access to the courts of this land so that they can right any wrong that they feel. They took the rule of law, but only insofar as Indians were concerned, and they turned it upside down. And they protected themselves from any legal proceedings that Indians might want to commence. But that wasn't enough for them. In addition to that, with the Saskatchewan Rebellion of 1885 that occurred, the government decided that they required some more amendments. Everybody knows that in the course of the Saskatchewan Rebellion, of course, the Métis people took up arms against the government of Canada in what is now the province of Saskatchewan. And they resisted the government's development into their area. But it wasn't just the Métis people who resisted that movement. Indian people in that area participated as well. And everybody knows that Louis Riel was hung as a result of his leading that fight. But few people know that at the same time that Louis Riel was hung, 38 Indian leaders were hung at the Regina Barracks.